Thanks for tuning in. So, the last episode we were talking about AI threat model, and I went through a sort of model on how I envision something that is a bit more complete than what is actually presented in the market. Every new conversation is part of my analysis and obviously is an evolving field. But there is something that I wanted to discuss about because during a chat with a friend of mine that is also a great security architect, I was trying to explain my concern on the agentic design. And I think during that conversation, I came up with a really good parallelism between what we used to do with microservices and what we are trying to achieve with agentic. And I think this conversation is really important because it's more stepping out of a market enthusiasm in terms of agentic and talk a bit more on the thinking, on the design thinking. So let's, as my usual, you find the presentation ready for download in my SlideShare. So just write SlideShare, my name and my surname, Carlo Dapino, and you'll find all the entire file that I'm showing here. So why, first of all, I use this parallelism? That means that it's not a one-to-one relationship, but it is more about what it means for IT, the microservices. So we had the infrastructure as a service. It was a monolithic big kernel. It got streamed into a container, and that container was given a microservice function. If you look in terms of parallelism, LLM is doing the same. You have a big LLM, a huge service running on top of that. You can have the coder, and we do know how the infrastructure is anyway kind complex. But from a logical perspective, the LLM is really similar to what it used to be the infrastructure as a service, the big monolithic service. And the microservice and the idea to strip down everything and have a dedicated service is similar to the microservice and is what agentic is actually trying to do. But the achievement it's not really there, and the security of a design is quite arguable. So here I'm explaining also not just the microservice in itself, is how the rethinking of a microservice force the industry to look at the service mesh, to look at how do microsegmentation across that service. So if I want to do an analogy in terms of component, you'll see that the infrastructure as a service was having various services, including network and storage, and the Kubernetes is having a control plane, a scheduling a policy. So that is really, really important because you realize how we stream down the Kubernetes, but we are not streaming down the agentic in the same way. And from a design perspective, in terms of architecture, but also in terms of thinking, is a big, big problem. Now, using the same parallelism, I try, because during the conversation with this friend of mine, we were discussing on how many things they are not thinking about the security of agentic and how much of a run there is to have agentic in a full mesh, but not really a microservice. There is no endpoint mutual authentication. There is a lot of that conversation. So in this paper, I'm just exploring a parallelism in thinking where you actually have an identity role as well, and you do have similar challenges in terms of securing the cluster of Kubernetes, having east-west uh, well locked down. So if you look at what we did into the microservice, we created a gateway. We created a sidecar, for example, for Istio, and with a sidecar channel, we were going to intercept all these calls and having visibility, having an understanding of what it was, but we had also in the Kubernetes an Alpine kernel or something really streamed down to the bare minimum. In agent is not happening. What I see is more having an agent with a full-fledged LLM that is going to be a problem. And even if you are going to reduce the scope of that agent, is seated there with that kind of knowledge in somehow. So you place guardrail to avoid to do stuff, but it's not the same design principle and thinking on how we did, for example, in the Istio parallelism. We do have also tools like Falco that care to have runtime. That is another runtime is another big problem that we are having right now in LLM, where runtime doesn't get explored too much. There is where actually there is a risk for malicious behavior built in into the model. So the security principle, the fold the knife for autonomous work. Here I'm trying to explain, for example, how having an agentic with a really bare minimum LLM with a RAG would be a better design, so that you would replicate the same line of thinking where we don't go for a full-fledged model, we go for a mini model. We do have the risk of hallucination that you can't reduce to zero, but you do your best to reduce it through a RAG. That shared RAG, it would be one of the main way of reducing also the scope, because you can access only to that specific data, but you still miss the overall east-west segregation, the mutual identity, the identity in terms of token and refresh or rotation more than everything. So the parallelism between the cloud workload logic and the agentic is really there. You do have controls about identity, policy, isolation, telemetry, and revocation as well. What happens if one of these agents get compromised? How do you restore the service? How do you avoid a lateral move? So this parallelism sounds really a stretch, looks like it's a stretch, but it's actually the same kind of thinking. Why in Kubernetes we made it to have a standardization of all framework and we can't make it in AI? Why each cloud service provider is having his own view on how the agentic need to be deployed and what is a threat model of the agentic. That is the kind of problem that I'm trying to highlight with this one. Also considering that each layer is having a role in the threat model, and we need to consolidate, but more than everything, the thinking and the design. So to close this parallelism is I would like to see a similar approach into architecture thinking in the AI, on how we secure the AI agentic. I would like also to reduce the capabilities of the agent itself, have proper mutual authentication, how we did it in multiple challenges in the cybersecurity space. We had the same with IoT. And actually it's a bit ridiculous because now we have an MCP protocol that it will be discarded and we will be back anyway to API. And there are tons of security concern about it, and so it's clear that something is wrong. But we don't have a proper approach like we did it in API with endpoint validation and that type of design. So you can use the parallelism that you want, but there is no challenge in east-west segregation that didn't need a sidecar, didn't need a service mesh. You always use a way to restrict the threat model. We are not doing that. So I hope you like this food for thought, because this one is more a conversation to trigger your thinking and use a parallelism across what is well known and standardized. It's actually one of the standard that we should reach is to have a standardization of the platform for agent, and having that control plane like we had in Kubernetes, we have in Kubernetes, where actually you define policy, you define control, you define guardrail. Not that we have each implementation differently, no standard, no gateway, no service mesh, and most of this one is anyway running sometimes even into a container. And that add more complication because it doesn't make it simpler, but it could actually be standardized also in that, because if you run the agentic in a pod in a cluster, you could leverage all security that you have in the Kubernetes to do that. So I hope you like. As you know, I'm doing my best to share everything. You have a presentation there.